And these could be people in your own families going back, depending on sort of, again, how people's lives purred it out. But that our failure to sort of, I think, capture these stories contributes now, last point I'll make, to this real sort of, I feel like there's an antagonism where a lot of people who, I'll choose my words carefully, but a lot of people who think they're smart think that the people in that photograph are dumb. And I feel like that's part of the problem we have right now in the country.
Hi, everybody. My name is Steve Guerrero. I'm the Director of Education here at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. Thank you for coming tonight. It's our inaugural lecture of the 25-26 season. A couple of things before I introduce tonight's speaker. We will be hearing about workers tonight. And this is a museum of the working class, the industrial working class. We are a museum dedicated to telling the story of skilled workers who built America, starting from the Industrial Revolution and continuing now and into the future. So I want to start by saying that I thank you for coming out tonight, and I want to share with you the fact that we were going to boost this talk through Facebook. We were able to advertise on Facebook and let people know that this talk is happening. And we got a message back: your ad has been rejected because it mentions politics or is about sensitive social issues that could influence public opinion, how people vote, and may impact the outcome of an election or pending legislation. Our policy for running ads, blah, blah, blah. Let me be very clear. When we talk about the industrial working class, we're talking about something political, and that's right. And I think we should lean into the fact that the middle class, the working class, are the backbone of America. And it's right for us to discuss the history and the future of that class. And that's why I'm so proud to have distinguished Professor Robert Forrant of UMass Lowell here to talk specifically on that topic. His book couldn't be more relevant. His book is called Where Are the Workers? Labor's Stories at Museums and Historic Sites. Like, we're literally in that place. In fact, I pulled, I didn't share this yet with Bob. This is a master plan from the museum's founder, Michael Brewster Folsom, who was an MIT teacher of industrial history. In fact, in the 1970s, he would bring students out here to this site, this National Historic Landmark site, that has that designation, because Mike saved this place. Mike Folsom knew the history of what had happened here, the building of the industrial working class, starting with the mill girls, the first batch of mill girls who worked right here at this site, and who staged the first industrial labor strike in 1821 in American history, right here. We have a letter in our When Waltham Strikes exhibit displayed where it says, from a machinist to his brother writing, on payday, they cut every unmarried man's pay without warning. And he said, they tried to play the same trick off on the girls, and they as one revolted, and the work stopped 2 days in consequence. And that's the first industrial labor strike in American history. So Mike Folsom, in creating this place as a museum, he writes in his mission statement for the museum, this is the museum of the Industrial Revolution. We are here to tell how the ingenuity and sweat of Yankee mechanics, factory hands, and entrepreneurs won economic independence for the United States, and how the muscles and brains of millions who settled here from many nations went on to make this the most prosperous, influential, and emulated industrial country on earth. To understand the role of industrial development in our lives and to help create a more informed citizenry, we are opening a center in which we can invite the public to explore the roots of modern industry and the heritage of industrial opportunity, initiative, and the sacrifice that has shaped the world we know. Technological and entrepreneurial innovation, mass production, and industrial labor are the forces that built modern America. The museum's task is to explain how and why that happened and what it means. And so that's why this goes back to 1983, but even today in 2025, I'm so proud to have a talk like this tonight. I'm even proud that Facebook finds it too political, because this is a topic that couldn't be more relevant or more important. And so with that, I'm very proud to invite up Professor Bob Forrant of UMass Lowell. Bob, welcome.
I didn't know I was going to get in trouble for being here. Pardon? Yeah, I mean, whatever. It is kind of interesting that would be what you would, with everything else that makes it onto Facebook and Instagram and X and whatever. That this is the thing that strikes a nerve. Fascinating. So I want to tell you a little bit about me, and then talk about what I was planning to do this evening. The poster hangs on my office wall, partly because I want my students at UMass Lowell to understand where all the things on the poster came from, because my students don't realize that the weekend, minimum wage, workers' compensation, grievance procedures at work, civil rights, occupational safety and health, parental leave, all the things up there came not because somebody magically said, poof, you can have those things. They came because people died. They exist because people organized, fought, tried to think through and figure out a way to exhibit their power as working people, as working families. And it's never been easy. But at the same time, the history doesn't get taught. And so that's why my friend and I, Marianne Trasciatti, who teaches in New York, we decided to do this book. She spent quite a few years in New York City working to get a marker, a memorial to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fires. She was the chairperson of a committee that raised money. And believe it or not, that fire in 1911 did not have a historic marker anywhere in New York City until last year. I personally find that quite incredible. And I had spent 5 years working in Lawrence, Massachusetts in preparation for the 100th anniversary of the 1912 Bread and Roses strike. And there was no marker of any kind or exhibit of any kind on any great scale in Lawrence, talking about the fact that this was one of the landmark strikes in American labor history. And so I worked with the community and the Lawrence History Center. We built an exhibit, and now there's also a memorial, a marker on the Lawrence Common to the strikers, people that lost their lives in that strike, and to the issues that were raised in the strike. And so I really do take this to heart. Before I was academic at UMass Lowell, I actually worked for 15 years as a machinist at a large factory in Springfield, Massachusetts that had 1,500 workers in it. And I was elected from the workers. I was the union business agent for a few years before the factory abruptly closed in 1986. And I did community organizing after that, and then went back to graduate school, got a PhD, and was, I think, quite fortunate to get hired at UMass Lowell to teach. And so I come at this in a really sort of interesting way, unlike a lot of my colleagues who go high school, college, PhD, university. I definitely took a wide detour before I ended up at the university. And so I've always had an interest in labor history. I grew up in a working class family. My dad was a butcher. He was a meat cutter at the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, the A&P. Some of you, I'm sure, remember the A&P. It's not around anymore, but he worked 40 years at the A&P in Beverly, Mass, cutting everybody else's roast beef and steak and pork chops and whatever else it was. The best thing about that job was that we always had meat on Sunday. Somehow it magically appeared on the, sorry Dad, I'm ratting you out. I mean, he's not here anymore, so we can't get in trouble. I always wondered later in life how all these prime cuts of beef ended up on our table. I think that was probably a benefit of the job. And when I went to college, I was the first person in my family to do so. And I spent 5 years at Northeastern University when it was affordable, and got a bachelor's degree. And throughout all that time, I never once came in contact with anything that remotely talked about somebody like my dad, that talked about workers. It would talk about entrepreneurs, investors, Henry Ford, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, all these business magnates and the robber barons, depending on how you looked at it, but not a lot about who actually did the work. I went from there to graduate school at UMass Amherst, and in graduate school after Northeastern, I came in contact with a labor historian who became a fast friend of mine by the name of Bruce Laurie, who has written a lot about labor history in New England and in Massachusetts in particular. And that was the first time that somebody really made me think, wow, there is actually a working class history. There is like a whole sort of story to tell and a way to do research and a way to write and a way to think about sort of economic development, economic activity more from the bottom up than from the top down. And actually, his classes made me really think about this question of who does the work. And while I was in graduate school, I had a house fire, and I lost all my research. I was working on my dissertation. That's how I ended up taking the wide turn. And this is before thumb drives and storage devices and clouds and all that good stuff. And so everything that I had was gone, lost it all, and quit. I said, okay, this is a sign. I'm not supposed to do this. A friend of mine was working at this place in Springfield called American Bosch, which made car parts, truck parts, fuel injection systems for submarines and airplanes and whatnot. And he said, they're hiring. I had 2 small kids. I needed a job. And I said, well, I really don't know much about this, but, and he said, well, they're starting an apprenticeship program. You can come in on the ground, from the ground up and learn. And I said, okay, that sounds like, I had no idea what I was necessarily getting myself into. And then, like I say, spent about 15 years doing that before the place closed, at which point I took that as another sign that maybe I should go back to school. And I was fortunate that Bruce Laurie was still at UMass Amherst. We had to finagle my way back into the university because I had been gone for such a long time that they didn't necessarily have to take me back if they didn't want to. But they basically obviously said, okay. And I wrote my dissertation then on something completely different than what I was originally writing about. I wrote it about a history of workers in the Connecticut River Valley and a history of skilled workers, machinists, people like me who had been doing this work for a dozen or so years, trying to, again, write a long view history of the Connecticut River Valley. And I likened it at the time to a modern 128 or Silicon Valley, that the Connecticut River Valley attracted these highly skilled people. And they were equally as important as the investors, maybe more so, because the investors had money, but they didn't actually know how to make things. It actually took living, breathing people. And so in a roundabout way, I think I always wanted to write this book. And living in Lowell, where the Lowell National Historical Park is, living in New England, where there are a lot of historical parks and museums and galleries that I visited over the years, I was always, I don't know if disappointed is the right word, but I was always wishing there was more about workers and labor history. And so, hence the book. So I want to read a little bit and then sort of proceed with the slides. Hopefully I can, yes, I can see. All right, so why the book? In organizing the curriculum, a collection of essays on labor history in the schools, teacher-educator Leah Bennon asked, why does our culture obscure the true significance of labor? Benin contends that the obscuring of labor's significance is purposeful and an effort to, quote, render the very existence of labor invisible. even to those who labor. A survey of the U.S. landscape supports Benin's contention. At national parks and at numerous other sites where significant labor and working class history occurred, much of that history is unmarked. Visitors can spend time at the overwhelming majority of U.S. national parks, although they're all closed today, so you can't do that today, museums and historic sites, and not even casually bump into treatments focused on workers and labor history. Places that make an effort to present labor history sometimes offer simplified or sanitized accounts that minimize or even erase aspects to promote a particular point of view or avoid controversy. Museums, galleries, and archives also further the impression, sometimes unwittingly, that labor history is not part of U.S. history. Labor and working class history can be placed on a proverbial milk carton labeled missing. And so with that, we basically launched into the book, and the idea of the book was to enlist people who were thinking along similar lines around the country and talk to people in different localities who have been trying one way or another to put more labor history in museums, galleries, archives, and historic collections. And so that's basically what the book is about. And what I want to do is sort of give an overview, I guess, of labor history, but from the bottom up, or from the worker side of things, to sort of talk about what I think is missing. And so one of the more important, one of the more significant events in American labor history is this famous strike in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Famous to me, but not famous to most people. They don't really know that it happened. We know Andrew Carnegie. There's the Carnegie Endowment for the Humanities. There are a bunch of places around the country where Andrew Carnegie donated money for libraries. He was really trying to buy grace, I think, so that he could get into heaven at some point when he passed away. But Carnegie, who was the wealthiest man in the world at the time, called out the state militia to crush a worker strike. And when we talk about Carnegie, we talk about this history, there's very little, even in Homestead, there's very little that actually talks about the strike. Another famous sort of incident in this history, George Pullman, who made sleeping cars on trains. The way to travel back in the day, if you were going coast to coast, was you get on a train that had sleeping cars, sleepers. And they were built by George Pullman at a factory in Chicago. And workers at Pullman were highly exploited. They were living in company-owned housing. Pullman had control over both their wages and their rents. So workers could ask for a raise. He would give them a raise, but then he would raise the rent and get the money back. So they never really ever could get ahead. And ultimately, they went on strike. Pullman went to Grover Cleveland, the President of the United States, and said, "You have to help me break this strike." And federal troops were used to crush the strike of Pullman car workers. An incredibly violent confrontation. 30 workers lost their lives. It's interesting now when we debate, have federal troops ever been used before against a community or whatever? There's certainly in labor history any number of instances where this happened. The thing about this, which again people don't necessarily know, the first Monday in September is what? Anybody know how we got Labor Day? We got Labor Day because Grover Cleveland was running for president shortly after the strike, and he was terrified that he was going to lose the working class vote. And so he hurried through Congress Labor Day holiday so that he could persuade workers that he really liked them. And so that's why we have Labor Day. But again, it's ironic that, which I've done on Labor Day, I've gone to like 50 of my friends at a party and said, "Anybody know why we have Labor Day?" No. Again, it's sort of it's missing. It's not in the curriculum in Massachusetts public schools. It's not sort of anywhere. This is another incredibly famous, but as well violent incident. So I've given you three situations here where famous people summon troops to shoot their workers. Ludlow Massacre in 1914. Workers are striking the mines owned by John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller wants to put an end to the strike. He basically hires a private army that he outfits and as well calls in Colorado's National Guard, the militia, that's what they were called at the time, and they basically shoot up the camp that workers' families are living in and that workers are living in, and kill women, basically kill women and children in this massacre. At the site of the massacre, mine workers decided fairly recently, in the 80s, to put a monument up to what happened. And again, the kind of thing that I'm advocating for at these particular sites. They put this up, and you can see, this is what it looked like. Somebody desecrated it. They cut the arms and they cut the hands and the heads off the statuary. And the mine workers, when they saw it, they basically said, we have to restore this. But so that was important to do, but again, this idea, the significance, the mine workers president says, this is our Vietnam Veterans Memorial, our Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, our Lincoln Memorial. There's no question whatsoever that this monument will be restored. Again, sort of the attachment to this history that once people get to sort of, to see this. The last horror story, I think, I don't have any more. I mean, I know I'm starting with 5 grim things here. This is, again, something most people don't know about. This is on Memorial Day of 1937. The Great Depression has been upon the country for several years. Workers have begun organizing. Workers have begun building unions to push back against big companies in the auto industry, the steel industry. At Republic Steel in Chicago, there's a massive strike to get Republic Steel to recognize the United Steelworkers of America as the bargaining agent for workers at the mill. On Memorial Day, workers are having a big family picnic, and they decide on the spur of the moment to go over to the gates of the factory to march around for a bit. They have their wives with them, their children with them. Inside the factory, the owners have basically outfitted a private army, waiting for those workers to come. As they approach the gate, they open fire. And so the violence, again, 10 people are killed, 100 people are wounded. Everybody that ends up in the hospital, everybody that passes away is shot in the back. People are fleeing when they're being shot. This is another example of the lack of education about these things, the lack of sort of putting in the minds of folks in high school, at the university, in the community, people coming to a museum like this one, that again, all those things on that poster we started with came out of this kind of struggle. This is the protest after the fact in Chicago. And the signs are pretty powerful. They're asking the mayor who gave the order, 10 dead men will picket here forever. These things are embedded in the communities where they happen, but they're not necessarily transferred outside those communities. And again, that's what we were hoping to push. The idea with the book was to persuade people in museums, galleries, to invest in the research so that these stories could come more to life. The idea from the book also came from somebody a friend of mine, Jim Green, who sadly passed away way too young. But Jim Green taught labor history at UMass Boston. And he basically issued in an article that he wrote this challenge to labor historians that we needed to get out there in the public sphere and not just hole ourselves up in a classroom or a library. That we needed to gather stories and we needed to work with communities to help them document and tell their stories. And he always was somebody that I looked up to in the work that I did. Waltham, you make the scene here. You all have done it. I mean, that's a really terrific exhibit sitting right within eyesight. Hopefully everybody got a chance to look at it before we started, but look at it before we go if you haven't already. And so historians now are beginning to, not everybody, but a lot of us are beginning to think about this as a kind of a research question, I guess you could say, but also kind of a think question. What happens when people are omitted from history? What happens when people don't appear? And this sort of, again, the way it's raised, what are the implications of not being able to find any or very few traces of the past left by people who look like you, share your cultural background, or speak the same native language? What impact do these archival absences have on how you might understand your place in society? So this got us thinking as we were writing the book. It's a question of like visual display, but it's also a question of what we value as historians, as archivists, as people who preserve manuscripts, in terms of what it is that we collect. If we don't collect labor histories, if we don't collect workers' stories, if we don't sort of, like make it known that we're interested in gathering these things, somebody like me who wants to tell that story can't tell it. Because there isn't anything that I can use, right? If I want to be legit, there's footnotes, there's sources. You can find out everything in this book where it came from. I didn't make it up, right? But if you're missing, if you're not archived, if your story isn't collected, you're missing from history. And so I often thought, like, this made me think a lot about, like, my dad. My dad loved going to museums, loved going to galleries, was always like a reader, an avid reader. I mean, loved reading because my mom and dad always had books and always were reading. And I often wondered as I sort of progressed academically, like what he thought when he would go to these places and like not see anything that resembled his particular story. And so I want to talk a little bit about stuff I'm doing now and then stop and we can have enough time hopefully to have a good chat. So living in Lowell, I've decided, amongst other things, to write a massive amount of stuff on the immigration history of Lowell. And so I wrote for the Lowell National Historical Park a history of Lowell immigration, which then they used to build a new immigration history exhibit as part of the museum and gallery space that they have in Lowell, Massachusetts. And as I was working on that and accumulating material and writing the story with a colleague of mine in the history department, I started finding these photographs. And I started trying to figure out and think about, okay, what do we do with something like this? How do we tell this story? Is there a way, and I don't know if there is or there isn't, is there a way to identify who any of those people are? Is there a way to find out, without going crazy, who any of those people are and who their, who the next generation of those people were? Is there a way to find out who, for example, this woman was, and if let's hypothetically say she had 3 kids, what happened to them? So that you could actually begin to write sort of a generational history of working people, working families. And so what I've started doing, and I've actually been able to start to identify people, is I started using social media. There are a whole bunch of social media sites in Lowell. You lived in Lowell, and you grew up in Lowell, and you lived in this neighborhood, Lowell, and I would post these photographs and say, anybody know anybody in this photograph? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes I think it might be my great-grandfather, I'm not sure. But to me, this is a beautiful photograph. And when I found it, and wanted to do something with it, I was the first person that actually did that. And I felt badly for the people in the photograph that this hadn't seen the light of day. This is another Lowell photograph. I'm trying to figure out who these people are. There's a whole collection of photographs like this of people who did the work of maintaining the city. Every city had people who basically kept the city from falling apart. Repaving the roads, relaying the trolley track, making sure the streetlights went on, doing all, and there's still those people today. But there's almost, I can't find much where people actually do the history of the folks that maintained the city, like those workers. And so there's a whole collection of photos like this, hundreds and hundreds of glass plate negatives of these folks. And they all have some sort of a legend with them, because the person who took the photographs worked for the city engineers in the city of Lowell. And so basically, I think what they were doing is documenting that people were actually working. I don't think they were basically trying to save these photos for posterity. I think it was a documentation that they dug up the road and they replaced whatever they were replacing and put it back together. But I want to know who these people are. This is the monument, the marker for the Bread and Roses strike of 1912. This appeared in 2012. It took 100 years before people decided there should be a marker on the Lawrence Common. The Lawrence Common was the meeting place for all the really, really big strike meetings. And again, the idea of why these matter. John Bodner is another labor historian. He's written a lot about the steel industry and steel mills. And he makes this point: sites of conflict in labor history also evoke a discordant memory of what social reality felt like, the kind of memory that by its very existence threatens the sacred and timeless nature of official expression. What he's really saying is something like this represents sort of, I think, probably why Facebook banned your ad. You're basically promoting class conflict. And so we can't have that. And in this case, it was interesting. The mayor of Lawrence had to okay this, so did the city council, because we were putting it on public land. And they did. And we went to the meetings like thinking there would be a fight. And there wasn't. This is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire Memorial. It basically, you can't see all of it. It basically goes up the building. The fire, if you remember from any history you might have had, happens on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floor of a building, which is a factory building in 1911 when the fire happens. Today it's owned by NYU, by New York University. And New York University didn't want anything on the building that basically reminded anybody that the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire had happened in the building, even though obviously everybody knows NYU didn't start the fire. But they didn't want anything to do with having a marker of any kind. And it took years for people to persuade the people at NYU to agree. And then NYU insisted that the Triangle Committee that was going to do this raise sufficient funds to basically have like a massive liability insurance policy in case something happened to the marker or the building. And they basically put them through hoops, but eventually they were able to raise the money and get the marker put. If you're curious, you can go, if you just do a Google search of Triangle Factory Fire Memorial, you can see, they did like an international competition for an architect and a designer, but it happened, but again, 112 years after the fact. My point. Visitors can spend time at the overwhelming majority of U.S. national parks, museums, historic sites, and not even casually bump into treatments focused on work, workers, and labor history. This is an exception to the rule, and it's an exception to the rule because of the founder who built this concern into the very inception. This is the West Virginia Mine Museum, Mine Wars Museum. This is an interesting, small storefront museum. You can't completely tell how, it's really quite, I've been in there, it's really quite small, but it's incredibly powerful when you go. It was in the news about 6 months ago because Bernie Sanders went there. He went to West Virginia to give a speech, and on the way, basically, he stopped off, and so there was stuff on the nightly news about him going through the museum. But when we were writing the book, somebody working on a chapter about this museum interviewed a board member from the museum whose dad had been president of the mine workers. And this quote is really compelling. When a region or a country doesn't know its own history, it's like a person with Alzheimer's. When people don't know who they are, they become much easier to manipulate. This museum is our own form of reclamation. It's cultural or identity reclamation. I mean, I found that so moving when we were editing the book and putting it together. And there's just so much in this museum, all packed in this tiny place, which is all that they could afford to do. This is a project that I'm working on now in Lowell. And the story behind this photograph, again, like how stuff is collected or not collected. This is the Textile Workers Organizing Committee in Lowell in 1936. There's a national textile mill strike in 1936 where almost all the textile mills in the country are shut, and workers are trying to get the Textile Workers Union recognized as the bargaining agent for workers. And I have been working for 6 months with the Merrimack Valley Central Labor Council because they asked me to help them do an exhibit on the history of labor in the Merrimack River Valley and create an exhibit for them. And so I've gotten to know a lot of the people in the various unions and in the union office where the Central Labor Council is. And sort of somewhat out of the blue, this guy comes up to me, Michael Earl, who's an organizer with the United Teachers Union in Lowell. And he says, I have some stuff you might want. And I have no idea what he's alluding to. And he says, in my basement, I have all the papers of my great-grandfather. And so I said, I don't know who your great-grandfather is, I'm sorry. And he said, he was the head of the Textile Workers Union Organizing Committee in Lowell in 1936. And he goes to his desk and comes back and hands me that photo. And that's the guy right there with the tie. And so I now have that photograph in my possession and all the letters that he was corresponding back and forth with other organizers in other parts of the country. I shouldn't say I have them. I'm going to give them to the library at the university. But again, the idea of somebody that even obviously though Mike understands how important his dad was to all of that somehow those papers and everything are in his basement. A lot of them, he said, oh yeah, by the way, a lot of the stuff was ruined because I had a flood in my basement. And so these are the things I managed to save. It was like, oh, that's soul crushing. But again, this is the problem of trying to figure out how we reach somebody and say, like, get that stuff out of your basement. Like we whoever the we is, want to collect that stuff, want to save that stuff. And again, from the book, mainstream academic and popular culture narratives typically minimize the importance of class as a category of social analysis and class struggle as pervasive element of US history. As a result, stories of working class activism, and with a few notable exceptions such as the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, of the violence visited upon working people under capitalism, are typically relegated to the margins of public memory. This is another big example. This is a sit-down strike by the United Auto Workers in a General Motors factory in Flint, Michigan workers, believe it or not, stayed in the factory, lived in the factory for 44 days. They decided it made more sense to stay in the factory than be walking around outside the factory and get shot and beaten up. They would be safer, and they would maybe have more leverage if they tried something different. You can see why that would frighten people in terms of that history being a more prevalent history. A couple more and I'm done. At least done, hopefully you'll have questions and comments. So in working on this exhibit, one more story. In working on this exhibit for the Central Labor Council, I started this summer going through archives and newspapers and trying to read about union activity in the city, worker activity in the city, and I came across these two photographs that somebody had posted on social media, and they wanted to know if anybody knew who they were. And I said to myself, what's this company? Atlantic Parachute. I had not run across this company before. And I thought, well, I have time to kill. I'm in the archive. Maybe I'll ask somebody or see if there's anything in the directories of what's in the museum. And there's some stuff about Atlantic Parachute. Then I go to the Lowell National Park and I say to the archivist of their library, do you have anything about Atlantic Parachute or about parachutes in Lowell? Like, what's this thing about parachutes in Lowell? And the person that helped me said, I don't know much about it, but we do have a lot of stuff. And nobody's ever really looked at it. And I thought, okay, well, I'm the guy. Open the box. Let me see what's inside. These are badges of workers who worked in this parachute company. There were 3 parachute companies in Lowell during World War II that produced more parachutes than any other place in the United States. And so I said, as I started uncovering this, so you mean that without Lowell, D-Day wouldn't have happened? Because how many people came down in parachutes, and how many of those parachutes would have been made in Lowell? So I immediately jumped to the conclusion that women workers in Lowell won the war. And some people liked that, and some people said that's like a real big leap. You can't really make that claim. And I said, I know, I'm only half kidding. But the point of it is, nobody knows this in Lowell. Everybody I go to, do you know that all these women during World War II made all these parachutes, and there were hundreds and hundreds of women making thousands of parachutes a week? And no, nobody knows. And I said, how can this be? This is to me like this is a serious dilemma. This also goes to speak to like women's history and why women's history isn't more in the forefront, but why in particular for my story, labor history, women's history, women workers' history. When the war was over, almost all these people were forced off the job and back into the home. And there are, I found, a few oral histories of some of these people. But this is my last slide. This is something I want to try to get Lowell to do. This in the book, people wrote about this project in North Carolina where Digital Innovation Lab at University of North Carolina was able to recover all these photos of mill workers over time and basically clean up and restore the photographs to the condition that you see them in here. And then they blew them up and put the faces in the windows of mill buildings around in North Carolina. And it's stunning. I have more photographs than this one, but this one really captures what it looks like. And again, you really get to see and understand who the people were who did the work. I mean, it's really a beautiful to me, it's like one of the best, like of all the things in the book, it's like one of the really best projects that we saw, and the collaboration between the University of North Carolina, the Digital Innovation Lab, mill workers' families who donated photos that they had. It's really, I actually get quite emotional when I look at that. That I wish there was something like that in every community that had a history of mill work and mill workers, that people would acknowledge in a way. I mean, I look at like all these faces, but I look at her and I want to know, what's your deal? Like, who are you? Like, what's going on? To everybody there. I mean, all these faces, right? And these could be people in your own families going back, depending on sort of, again, how people's lives purred it out. But that our failure to sort of, I think, capture these stories contributes now, last point I'll make, to this real sort of, I feel like there's an antagonism where a lot of people who, I'll choose my words carefully, but a lot of people who think they're smart think that the people in that photograph are dumb. And I feel like that's part of the problem we have right now in the country. We've so sort of walked away from what all of these folks represent about the country, about the history, about all aspects of who we are today, that in the end we've run out of ways to have any sort of civil kind of a conversation. And to me, it's really scary. And I do think that because we've minimized and misunderstood and not understood at all this history, and really tried to figure out the answer to the question of the book, where are the workers? We're drifting in some really weird world that my students ask me all the time, has it ever been like this? And I say, yeah, no, it hasn't been. I don't know, I can't think of a time in my life where it's been this way. And I do think if we did a better job with this stuff, we would at least begin to try to figure out a way to have a conversation that would be less divisive than the conversations that we're having today. Now I'll stop there. Thank you.
Can I ask you one question to take a host privilege?
Yes.
One of the things you touched on was the role of immigration and kind of this role that immigrant labor has had in kind of building and replenishing the industrial working class over time. Can you say a little bit more about the role of immigration in the industrial working class?
Yeah, so I mean, it's the easiest way, well, the cop-out way is to say it's really complicated, and then sort of move along, right? So I'll say it's really complicated. I mean, to a great degree, and using Lowell and using what I know about Lowell history as an example, mill owners in Lowell, mill overseers in Lowell were forever recruiting immigrant workers to come to Lowell. And they were doing that so that they would create competition between various immigrant groups in the city and pit people one against the other. The same thing happened in Lawrence when we were doing, I wrote like a couple books on the Bread and Roses strike, and the same thing happened in doing research on that. And so mill owners were famous for paying German workers several more cents than English workers, and paying English workers many more cents than Irish workers, and Irish workers more money than French Canadian workers. And basically trying to keep people from overcoming their differences. So on the one hand, there's an absolute story of immigrant labor being a backbone of what historians call the Second Industrial Revolution, say post-1875, 1880 to the end of World War II. That's a given. But immigrant workers and black workers were basically used as strike breakers, were recruited to be strike breakers, And then that would leave a legacy in a community where, well, those workers are strike breakers. And oftentimes workers are being recruited and they're not told there's a strike, they're just told there's jobs. And there's a famous strike in Lowell in 1933, a shoe strike, and there's thousands of workers on strike at all the shoe factories in Lowell, and from one side of the river come like a caravan of cars that are full of strike breakers, and they're all mostly Greek immigrants. And that really, like, for a moment turns like everybody in the strike, like they're yelling anti-Greek stuff instead of actually thinking, because that's, right, it's just a more visceral sort of reaction people have. And so it's a history that has to be told. During the Second World War, because there was a shortage of workers, in a lot of places, if immigrants were hired in any significant numbers or black workers were hired in any significant number, native-born white American workers would actually go on strike because they didn't want to work next to Italian workers or French-Canadian workers or black workers. And there were a series, particularly in the Midwest, there were a series of hate strikes that the federal government had to mediate because it costs production to support the war effort. And so it's a real, and so where, like the Bread and Roses strike is one of the examples that you can point to of what happened when people overcame those differences. There were 40 different languages in Lawrence at the time of the Bread and Roses strike. And the Industrial Workers of the World was the union that was organizing the workers in Lawrence. And they basically made a commitment that everything about the strike, all written material, all meetings, any kind of meeting like this, everything would be done in all the languages of everybody in the room. And they did it. And so they would basically, if I was up here speaking Italian, they would take everybody that didn't understand Italian, put them in little, what we would call now affinity groups, and somebody that understood Italian but also understood German, and all the German workers would be over here listening to someone who knew German and Italian tell them what me, the Italian worker, was saying. It made meetings take a lot longer, and they had a lot of outdoor meetings, and it was wintertime, but they did it. And so, again, that's a history that needs to be like more examined and more critically talked about. Even now, right, with everything happening now with with what's happening particularly to construction workers, laborers, farm workers, agricultural workers, home healthcare workers who are being chased by ICE, whatever you think about what they're doing, like I'm a little bit disappointed personally that a lot of unions haven't stepped up to try to figure out, okay, these are workers, these are working class people, how do we think about this? How do we respond to this? I wish there was more of a public presence than I think there is. I think some unions have been great at it, but I think for the most part, people have not dealt with it, and that's a problem. This is also a history that needs to be saved. The one thing that I learned about all of this is that so archivists who are thinking about this stuff call it, they have a term that they use called purposeful collection. And so what they do is they've decided what's not in your collection, and we're gonna actually go and try to find it, as opposed to waiting for somebody to show up typically an archive, like the ones in Lowell, waits until somebody dies, and somebody's cleaning the attic of their grandparents who passed away, and they bring 5 boxes of stuff to the doorstep of the Lowell Historical Society or the Center for Lowell History. Do you want this stuff? More often than not, people just toss it because they don't think it's important. And so again, part of the idea of presenting stuff like this is to try to persuade people, don't do that. Don't throw out your grandma's stuff. Let me look at it. Please let me look at it before you throw it out. Great question.
I'm struck by the picture of the textile workers organizing committee. Mm-hmm. How do you really work there? I mean, when you look at that, it's all these men, and there's a couple of women. I think that speaks something to the difficulty that we.
Yes.
Clearly, look at that. I mean,
Yep.
so many those women working for maybe that how are we going to even get voice in this?
100%. You're totally right. I mean, and it's still the case to a great extent today, right? Although, again, I think in certain unions it's changed, but I still don't think. But yeah, you're right. If you basically tried to do like the ratio of women and men in the textile industry in the 1930s, it would have, the scale would have tipped to there being more women workers than men. But that's the photo I was handed. So, but you're absolutely correct. I mean, I showed it to my students the other day, and one of them basically said, "Well, how come there aren't more women?" And I said, "Well, you know what we've been doing, like studying. What do you mean? How come? You know the reason. You know the right. You know the answer. Good on you to observe it. But yeah, and I'm trying to figure out. Like, it's funny. On the back of the photo are the names of four other people, besides the person in the middle, J. Michael, and it's hard for me to read. It's faded, and I can't quite read it, and so I kind of think I know the names, but I don't really. So I'm trying to look at old census records and things like that, and see if I can figure out. Like, I particularly want to know who. One of the women is named, but it just says there's just a name, but it doesn't say who it is. The other names it will say, like bottom, it says like this guy, right? Bottom row, far right, or whatever. But the women are there's just a name, and it doesn't say which person it is. And so I'm trying to, again, because I would love to know what happened to them, if I can figure it out. I mean, and with Ancestry.com and all the kind of tools you have now, if I could figure it out, I actually probably could find out a lot. Yeah, I would like to know if they went on to be involved in the Textile Workers Union after this, or like what did they stay in Lowell? Did they move? But at this point, all I'm trying to do now is get the exhibit done, because it's got to go to the printer on Friday. And so I'm not going to figure out who they all are between now and Friday. I've given up on that.
You mentioned the Bread and Roses strike several times. You never really explained what were they striking against, or what companies, etc.
Yes. So in Lawrence in the early 20th century is one of the largest woolen fabric producers in the world. And there's like a holding company called the American Woolen Corporation that owns several of the mills in Lawrence at the time of the strike. So strikers are asking, as anybody would have asked for at the time, more wages. They're asking for safer work. The injury rates, the occupational hazards in textile mills are extraordinary during this period of time. Life expectancy for a typical textile mill worker in 1912 is late 30s. So they're also asking for rules and regulations on child labor. There aren't any yet in the Commonwealth. And so they're trying to raise their own wages so they don't have to have their young kids working in the mills, because that's pretty much what's happening now. To make a family wage, you have to have your young kids working. Parents are actually falsifying their kids' birth certificates to make them be old enough, because the one law in the books at that time is until you're 14, you're supposed to be at least in school half a day. And then you can get a work permit card and leave school early and go to work, but you have to show that you're 14. And so kids as young as 10 or 11 are having their parish priest falsify their birth certificate. Parents are paying the priest. I mean, this comes out in the investigation of the strike. They also want a union. They don't have a union. They want some union representation. So that's basically boils down to they want a living wage. with everything that would have entailed. They don't want to be working 65 hours a week and having to decide whether they buy coal or they buy food or medicine, which is kind of like what their lives are like. So January 11, January 12, mills start shutting down in the city. People refuse to go to work, and by the 13th, 14th of January, there's somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people out on strike. Almost everybody that lives in Lawrence either works in the mill or makes a living doing something in the mill. Still a lot of the mills, if you drive up that way, if you go up 495, like going toward New Hampshire, if you look to your left as you're going to New Hampshire, you can see a lot of the mills. Lawrence had some of the largest mills ever built. They dwarf the mills in Lowell, actually. They're significantly bigger. Strike turns very violent, but eventually Congress gets involved, and Congress holds hearings on the strike. And for the first time that we know, the president at the time is William Howard Taft. His wife goes to the hearings on the strike and becomes very supportive of the strike, and actually makes a $10,000 donation to the strike committee, and invites a bunch of child laborers in the mills have gone to testify before Congress. And there's cool photos of the kids getting on the train in Lawrence to go to nation's capital, and she invites them back to the White House to meet the president. And so they do, and they come back to Lawrence, and about 3 days later, the strike is over. What we suspect, so the woolen industry is highly protected with tariffs. What we think happened is William Howard Taft's wife leaned on William Howard Taft, and William Howard Taft called William Wood, the head of the American Woolen Corporation, and said, if you don't figure this out, we're going to remove the tariff. And so do what's good for you. We have no proof that actually happened, but that's my story. I can't prove that, but
Did they get what they wanted?
they did get what they wanted, but not a union. They got everything they wanted, but not any sort of a stable organization of any sort. They were organized primarily by a group called the Industrial Workers of the World. The Industrial Workers of the World did not believe in capitalism, and so they didn't believe in a union contract where you would sit with a capitalist and negotiate an agreement. They basically said the agreement should be enforced by the workers, not by a piece of paper. And so while the IWW did a lot of cool things, I think in the strike, this was a moment, really hard for workers to hold it together thereafter. So on the one hand, I'm appreciative as a historian of what they did, but on the other hand, it took until the 30s for there to be a more permanent textile union in Lawrence. And the problem with that in Lawrence and Lowell is by that time the mills were leaving. They were leaving New England and going south and going to Central America and the Caribbean. And so workers had the advantage of, these folks that organized in Lowell had the advantage of union contracts and union jobs for just a few years before the mills started closing. By the 1950s, they're tearing the mill buildings down in Lowell and in Lawrence. The industry is pretty much dead at that point. It's a sad story, but that's another story to tell. Yeah, good question.
Thank you. I came in late, so I hope this is on recording.
It is.
The first name. Yeah. So I love Lowell. I'm from Buffalo, New York, so I'm not from here. But when we came here in '83, within a couple of years, I took my kids up to the National Historic Site, the mills, and I was blown away. And the memories. Family members died right then. I'm just so impressed with what's happened in Lowell. Because I go up there, I'm very friends up there. I always go to the museum. I have a question. I could say lots of things, but what is that street that you showed the picture of with the workers digging the bricks and?
What's the street?
Yeah, I'm curious.
Central Street.
Central, okay.
One of the main streets into town.
Pardon?
One of the main streets into the city.
Yes, I know what it is today. I just think Lowell is the end of the world.
Yep. Well, I feel like when I think about having taught there for 30 years, I kind of died and went to heaven. Like if I was going to pick out a place to teach at, I couldn't think of a more apt place in terms of what I like.
But thank you for doing what you're doing.
Yeah,
Because I grew up in a family of factory workers and union people, and they certainly have been forgotten. So what you do is so important for so many people.
Trying.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's somebody here, yep. Wait for the technology.
I just want to know what's happening as far as the park now with the shutdown. Are they doing any tours now or anything?
So as of this morning, the Lowell Park and every other park is shut, and so they're just shut. Basically, if you could go and knock on the door and they won't let you in.
They said they were going to keep them open.
Yeah, well, they're not.
They said the outdoors would be open, but the indoors would be.
Well, it's pretty hard to close the Grand Canyon, I guess. But in Lowell, everything's inside. I mean, you can go to Lowell and walk around. You can go to Lowell and see the canals, but you can't get a canal boat ride. You can walk by the trolley, but you can't get a trolley ride. And you can't go into the physical exhibit spaces. And yeah, I mean, we had a faculty meeting this morning, which I hate, but we had one at 8 a.m. And somebody from the park was supposed to come and talk about internships for our students. And at 8:25, we got a text that he wasn't coming because he's not working. And so that's how we knew that actually it had, that had. Yeah, I mean, the same thing happened like a few years ago, and it was that park was closed for over a month. I mean, it was a really pretty long shutdown. So the problem for this now is that so many schools have school trips planned, and so at least for the time being, obviously those aren't going to happen. But yeah, it also means I can't. So this research that I'm finishing, if I have to do any double checking, I can't do it because the archive where all this stuff is in a building that's owned by the park. The university is in there with a research library in one half of the building, but when there's a shutdown like this, the building is locked because it's the park that has the keys. And so I can't, so fortunately, thankfully, I'm always usually ahead of the game, and so even though it's like Friday, I'm not panicking. But I also have an excuse. If anybody doesn't like it, I can say, well, if it wasn't for the shutdown, I would have figured this out. So I have a built-in excuse. But yeah, it's actually, it happened, when it happened, was it 2018 or 2019? I mean, again, it was pretty disruptive to people doing research, but it's more disruptive, obviously, to the people's lives who are not going to get paid.
Bob, I want to thank you for your time tonight. Thank you for your work, and thank you for being here.